Welcome, everyone, to this week's edition of the Center for Data and Computing Distinguished Speaker Series. Our speaker this week is Timnit Gebru. But first, I'll turn it to CDAC Director Nick Feimster to introduce the center in the series.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back. We're now in the midst of our series on socially responsible AI, and as I mentioned, we're very lucky to have Timnit Gebru joining us today, which for what I'm sure will be a very interesting talk. Let me just first say a couple of words about our center. Many of you who've been attending our series have heard this, and so I will keep it brief. But for those of you, for this is your first time at the CDAC Distinguished Lecture Series or CDAC Talk, the Center for Data and Computing is the nexus for data science research on campus here at the University of Chicago. There are a bunch of different, it's a university-wide initiative. There are a bunch of different activities, including a discovery grant program. We have some new awardees, which if you haven't heard about yet, I think you'll be hearing about very soon. There's a postdoc program that has some great postdocs working on a wide variety of topics and disciplines. There's a seed grant program with more than 50 PIs across campus in just about every academic discipline. And then we have this very exciting speaker series, as well as an industry speaker series, as an industry outlook series that's going on as well. I could spend longer talking about these things, but I won't. I think we're here today to listen to and learn from Timnit. Timnit, oh, right, one more thing. I would be remiss if I did not mention that this particular talk from Timnit is jointly hosted and sponsored with the Stiegler Center. They are out of the Booth School, and they run a bunch of interesting publications. I think, like the topic of today's talk, I think if anybody's read promarket.org, you know that they do not shy away from controversy. And so glad to have Stiegler partnering with us on this particular talk today. Now let me turn to Timnit, who's our honored guest today. Timnit is a computer scientist. Her work explores algorithmic bias and the ethical implications of data mining. I think she's very well known for some of her work in the bias of facial recognition software. Her work with Joy on gender shades, right, was some of the first to show that facial recognition software was not very effective at recognizing Black women as it, particularly compared to white men, for example. In addition to some of her groundbreaking work in algorithmic bias, she is the co-founder of Black in AI, and she was formerly the lead of the ethical AI team at Google until recently, and I'm sure many people know a little bit about that, and maybe we'll hear a little bit more about some of that today. Without further ado, let me give the time to Timnit, because I think that's what we're all excited to hear about today. And so, Timnit, thanks once again for your time today, and we really look forward to your insights. Really looking forward to the talk.
Okay, thank you again for having me. Sorry, I was just completely couldn't hear anything. Okay, so I wanted to give this talk called "The Hierarchy of Knowledge of Machine Learning and Related Fields and Its Consequences." Maybe because it has it describes some of my struggles in this space that I'm in, and maybe some of the recent things that have happened to me. So by that I mean that I got fired from Google, and then my co-lead got fired from Google, and my team is really not in a good place right now. If you're aware of iClear, it's an international conference on learning and representation. One of the speakers was Ruha Benjamin, who said that computational depth without historic or sociological depth is superficial learning. And she goes on to further describe why an ahistoric and social approach to deep learning can capture and contain, can harm people. And so she describes why it's really important to to have this work grounded in a deep understanding of sociology and history. And later on, her and Meredith Whitaker were talking in some, I caught it in some radio station, and they talked about, and Ruha said, we have so many coding camps, but no social science boot camps for computer scientists. So this reminded me that I myself, I'm involved in a computer science sort of coding boot camp, a 1 month, very intense class, algorithms class for high school students called Advocacy. And but I've never seen any sort of boot camp for me to learn anything that's not in engineering or coding or AI or whatever it is. So that I was thinking, why is that? And that's the hierarchy of knowledge. That says that people who know how to code don't really need to go to other boot camps, but people who don't know how to code need to go to these coding camps because that's the more important knowledge in the world. So I kind of wanted to do a couple of things in this talk. The first thing I wanted to do is just talk a little bit about myself and my background and what my attitude to my work in science and technology was growing up and how that changed and what the effects of those were. So I grew up enjoying math and physics, and one of the reasons that I really liked these subjects were because I wasn't really learning about the outside, like the world and politics and the situations that were really affecting my life many times negatively. When I was 15, I left, a country I was born and raised in Ethiopia, and it was all very sudden. There was a war going on, and it was kind of, I didn't know what was going to happen in the future. But like focusing on my studies or focusing on some of these things gave me a feeling of a sense of control, right? Like you can escape into these things. But I saw them as things that were like completely disjoint from anything that was happening in the world. Another thing I do is I like dancing. And one of the few times I tried to like kind of try to merge there's been a few times where I tried to merge my interest in dance and music with my interest in engineering, let's say. So once I was trying to figure out like, why did I like dancing? Why did I learn how to dance? I felt like I learned how to dance better or maybe in a better way than my other studies. And I came across this article by Rachel Thomas, who was talking about, let me just check chats to see if everything is fine. Oh, it's all about, can you hear us? Can you hear us? We should do your talk. Okay. So I came across this article by Rachel Thomas, and she was talking about this former professor, Paul Lockhart, who stopped being a professor to teach K-12 math because he was saying that we are teaching math all wrong. And so he was saying, imagine if kids just couldn't sing. You couldn't sing a whole song until you learn all of the different the notations and all of these things until you had to do that by the time you were able to learn how by the time you were allowed to sing a song. And so what he's saying is that's how we're teaching math. Everybody has to learn all of these notations and other things before they can, have a full picture. Whereas when you learn music or dance or whatever, you can still see the full picture. You can still see what you're working towards without knowing all of the notations and things like that. So in addition to this, I was always taught, like I said, that science or technology is kind of disjoint from any sort of movement or social change. And what was really important was that I kind of worked on my technical abilities, and that meant a specific type of knowledge. And so here is on the left where I was trying to merge my interest in music and engineering, where it was like a class, and I tried to create like a single piano key. It was like some electronic lab class. And then based on that kind of interest, I joined the audio hardware group at Apple because it was also full of like engineers who somehow had a connection to music. So on the right is like some of the things I was doing there. So on the right here is like we had a prototype of like something called a delta sigma modulator. It's kind of one of the methodologies for that's used in many different things, for instance, in analog to digital conversion. And somehow I was really interested in these delta sigma modulators just purely from an abstract point of view. And I never thought about like sort of why these kinds of things became important. Like for instance, there's connections to World War II and radars and decoding, etc. Another stuff I didn't learn when I was doing all this work in electronics and engineering, electrical engineering, was the various backgrounds of all of the heroes that we learned about. So one example here is William Shockley, who won the Nobel Prize, I think, in physics for invention of the transistor, right? So we heard Shockley's name over and over and over again in our classes, over and over again. But he dedicated a big part of his life to eugenics and a lot of writings on eugenics. So this is one example. He talks about how the view that the U.S. Negroes inherently less intelligent than the U.S. white came from my concern for the welfare of humanity. And, a lot of times people try to compartmentalize these things. Oh, it's just in one location, or it's just in like the, ancient times or whatever. It's not, right? This is, Shockley has a lot of connections to Stanford, for instance. And I was a student at Stanford and I never learned these things. I think there are many reasons for this. But one of them, again, is this notion that this is irrelevant to kind of my studies about transistors, let's say. Other things I didn't learn about is how tech institutions and labs made their money. So this is one article that talks about, for instance, how it calls on these institutions to acknowledge their contributions to human suffering and international conflict. So same way that they're starting to acknowledge and come to terms with their histories with slavery, how a lot of them use slave labor, for instance, that it calls on these institutions to acknowledge their contributions to various international conflicts, i.e. wars, which comes full circle because war has been a very important, I guess, part of my life, but I never connected technology or any of these other things that I was interested in to war. I never learned about the connection between, labor history and how tech companies are right now affecting, the world in the way that, for instance, at Google, about when I was there, let's say 100,000 people might be full-time employees, but 130,000 were are contract workers, right? They don't have the benefits of full-time employees. There's a number of other companies like that. For instance, there was a whole campaign, Prop 22 campaign in California that was trying to give drivers for these ride-sharing companies rights, but the companies they fought it really hard. And in fact, they were harassing a labor economist, Vina Duval, a lot because they saw her as a threatening force. On the other hand, you used to have a machine learning lab or like a research lab at Uber full of people working on machine learning who probably thought that their work is completely disconnected from this kind of stuff that's happening. So all of this, I think, can be summarized as the view from nowhere that's been heavily critiqued by feminist studies, queer feminist studies in general, Black feminist studies, etc. And what is this view from nowhere? This view from nowhere is the notion that science, and I think, technology kind of, I feel like, is a descendant of science, is taught as if it's an objective truth that is seen from no one's point of view. It's not from anybody's specific point of view. It's just something out there. So we don't learn the fact that Shockley was an eugenicist because we teach people that that's irrelevant to, whatever things about the transistor we're learning, for instance. So one of the people I think who in AI who talks about this, I don't think he calls it the view from nowhere, but some of the things he discusses that are relevant to this is Sabelo. This is one interview that he had where he talks about many different things. But for instance, he also talks about how Leibniz was building ideas from Raymond Lund, who thought he could derive a symbolic language that could let him build a logic machine that would convert Muslims to Christianity through reason. And again, we don't learn these kinds of things because we think it's irrelevant to math or something like that. So on my end, because of this view from nowhere that I was conditioned to kind of accepting, I had to prove that I was a good engineer, and proving that I was a good engineer meant that I was quote unquote neutral and quote unquote technical, and that I didn't bring my point of view to the work, which is an illusion, as the view from nowhere the critique of the view from nowhere discusses. So when I was doing my PhD, I was very, careful to not be deemed as quote unquote an activist because, again, like that meant that I was not a good engineer, right? So that's a term that a lot of people in machine learning use to describe me. Rather than a scientist, a lot of times they do it in a way that distinguishes me from scientists. And this has actually happened to me during my one-on-ones with some people after I gave talks. So Mahdi, who joined the ethical AI team like 1 month before I got fired. Sorry. Talks about this a lot. So he's very good at. One of the things he does is he draws parallels between big tech companies and authoritarian governments, for instance. So what he says is that a lot of times when authoritarian governments want to target journalists, they call them activists, and they say that they distinguish between activists and journalists, and they say that the activists. So then they use this distinction to then target the activists. So this is why for me, when I was doing a PhD, like I said, it was very important for me to to say, okay, I'm the technical person. I'm not gonna I'm not doing this other stuff. But to the credit of my advisor, at some point, she told me I should merge my interest in social justice with, my interest in AI, and that I should do a thesis that is sort of merges those two things. But I really did resist that concept even when she talked to me about it, because I was like, why would I be the Black woman talking about Black woman things? But obviously now that's not the case. So juxtapose this with the interest in interdisciplinarity. So a lot of people talk about how interdisciplinarity is important. And in general, it depends on what kind of interdisciplinary. So in machine learning, for instance, people bring ideas from game theory, for instance, or they have or from physics-based models, etc. So there are some types of ideas that you bring from other disciplines that are considered good and rigorous and important. But what about ideas from history or critical race theory or anthropology? Are these ideas considered important and fundamental if you're bringing those ideas from those disciplines to machine learning? Generally, no. I don't know what's going on. I hear some beeps. Generally, no, because, and why is that? I would say it's because of gatekeeping and the hierarchy of knowledge. And this gatekeeping is a lot of times done by people in power against people who are not in power. So for instance, that's what happened to me at Google when people in power decided that with no explanation really, that I should retract this paper. And a lot of people sort of, I don't know, there's conversations that maybe it was profit driven and things like that. But I think at the root of it, it wasn't even honestly that. It was like a bunch of people who have power, who could do this, decided that this paper somehow had issues and they could just do this. And if you're at a conference or a journal, you'd have some sort of peer review process, and you'd have you try to even guard against this kind of power imbalance because of maybe the double-blind peer review process, et cetera. But we didn't have that here. So this kind of gatekeeping obviously is not new, and it's not new to this field or anything like that. But this book by Mar Hicks is a very good book to kind of talk about the evolution of, the computing industry and how women were kept out and started being gatekept and what kind of effects that had. So obviously, I think a lot of people know that the original computers were women, and it was considered like a woman's job, right? And it wasn't prestigious. It wasn't, well paid or anything like that. But at some point when this became a powerful industry, the women left and the men came. So again, like I said, gatekeeping is done by those in power, and it's not. This is not the first field to have that. So there's some examples, for instance, in decolonizing history. So in South Africa, there's a huge decolonized history movement. So one example is that a lot of oral histories are kind of not really taken seriously by a lot of Western scholars, whereas for instance, in my culture, there's a lot of history that's passed down through generations orally. There's a lot of decolonizing art examples. So most recently, what I've been doing, I would say in my work most of the time, is working with people from other disciplines, or even maybe in my own discipline, but who have ideas that bridge other disciplines, and so trying to bring them to machine learning. So I just wanted to cover that, give examples of that a little bit. One example is data sheets from electronics. So this is an idea where we wanted to have data sets be associated with a very detailed documentation about the characteristics of this data set and data set annotation and collection process. And not only that, but to give people a workflow for this data set annotation collection process. So this idea comes from electronics. So electronics have data sheets. Here is an example where, for instance, if this is I don't know if this is a capacitor or something, every component that you have in an electronic system is accompanied by a data sheet that tells you its standard operating characteristics, what happens as you change the temperature, what its non-idealities are, what you shouldn't do with it, etc. So that's what we wanted to do for data sets. A similar idea extends to models. So this is my co-lead, my former co-lead, because she got fired on Friday, and it's Monday today. So Meg Mitchell spent a lot of time working on this idea for models. And we not only did we write a paper, we also helped produce prototypes for this at Google. So another example is interventionist data collection, taking ideas from archival history. So this is with Unso Jo, who's an archivist. So she's an historian, and she knows a lot about how archival historians curate data and what kind of data annotation collection practices they have. Archives are the oldest discipline to gather human-related data. And so here's an example, this shows kind of what kind of process they go through and how much time they allocate for the data annotation collection practices. Another example is understanding of race and gender, and this comes from Joy Buolamwini. So this work was with Joy Buolamwini, who led this work, and it's been doing this work for a long, long time. And for this work, we had to bring our understanding of race and gender. So what you see here is for 3 different APIs that do binary gender classification, which has a lot of issues that I'll discuss a little bit later. So they give you, for a picture, it gives you an output of a binary output of whether the person in the picture is a male or female. That's the output. And so if you flip a coin and you guess, it's 50-50, right? So it's 50% chance. And so the darker and darker you go in skin type here, the especially IBM and Face++, they approached random chance at the time. And so why didn't we do this kind of work by race or by ethnicity or something like that? Well, because we know that race is a social construct that is unstable across race, space and time. So what it means to be a particular race in one country is very different from what it means to be a particular race in another country. What it means to be a particular race now versus 200 years ago is very different. And what race tells you is also unclear, right? It tells you about a classification system that was created by people, but doesn't necessarily tell you about some of the things you're trying to analyze here. In this case, we wanted to see whether an automated facial analysis system, how it worked, how its characteristics changed by a particular attribute that you can see, person's attribute. So in this case, skin tone. So our understanding of race and gender is important here, as was understanding a little bit of an understanding of intersectionality by Kimberly Crenshaw, right? Because she talks about how when you're talking about marginalization, if you just look at one attribute by itself, it doesn't necessarily tell you the whole story, right? So you can just look at, Black people and women, and if you don't look at the intersection of those multiple identities, you'll miss certain kinds of discrimination. For instance, discrimination against Black women. So she gives some examples of this. For instance, even in her, there's a short TED Talk where she talks about this that I highly recommend. And finally, there's an example where we work on where we bring ideas from, social choice theory, organizational sociology, machine learning, in this paper on diversity and inclusion metrics and subset selection, which I'm not really going to go through, but this also is a paper that tries to, if you're going to select a set from a larger subset, let's say I'm doing image search or something, and I want to make sure that my image search results are diverse and inclusive. How do I do that? What does diverse mean? What does inclusive mean? They're very complex kind of social things that we're trying to measure. So that's kind of how what this paper is about. Now, I want to talk about for the papers that I feel made impact, what is it that made them impactful? One is the focus on foundations, because if you don't have a foundation right, you can build a house, but it's going to fall, right? So in terms of focusing on foundations, what do I mean? We focused on we did a lot of work on process. We have a lot of work on process, like data sheets and model cards, and we have other kind of papers talking about the process by which we do certain things. For me, that's foundational. The other one is to focus on impact. So not like number of papers or number of things out all the time, but the impact of your idea, the first one, the one of them. So here, model cards is one example where the paper came out in 2019, but people are still we were still working on model cards when we got fired, in 2021, let's say. So here's an example where there was this prototype that we worked on, but we didn't just write the paper and move on to the next thing. Another one is making sure you understand the context and work with someone with who understands the context and has domain expertise. One of the most important things are collective movements. So here's one example. This example is so this is Deborah Raji, who so wow, weird. Okay, sorry. Oh, I figured what happened. So I was saying that I heard this beep and it was my own headphones. And I was sitting on some buttons and it would just kind of change things around. So anyway, sorry. So this example is Deborah Raji, who was lead author of a paper called Actionable Auditing. That was a paper that she wrote with Joy Buolamwini. So it's sort of, one of the things it showed, and this wasn't even a central thing about the paper, but one of the things it showed was that Amazon's recognition system could have similar biases to that of the biases that we showed in gender shades. And when this paper came out, Amazon VP after VP was trying to attack them, and we had to come to their defense. And I'll tell you how. But before that, I want to say that Deb told me a while back that by the time she found Black in AI, she was ready to leave the tech industry because there was too much isolation, too much discrimination, and she was ready to leave before she found this community, which allowed her to stay and thrive. And so this is a community that my colleague or my friend, Redit Abebe, and I co-founded and work really, really hard on. I think we spend as much or more time on this than our research because we find it to be, again, foundational. And if you focus on impact, you're focusing on the impact of something that you do, and maybe not like the intellectual stimulation you get out of it, because a lot of this work is not glamorous in any way. It's like, writing emails, I don't know, spreadsheets and talking to people and stuff like that. It's not necessarily the kind of thing you talk about in class. But this is one of the most important works, in my opinion, that I've done. And given in the hierarchy of knowledge in machine learning, it's not really even considered work, right? But it's one of the most important things I think we've done. Joyble, he has the Algorithmic Justice League that I suggest everybody follows. And this is kind of one of the headlines where, again, of how we came to their defense when Amazon was attacking them, VP after VP was attacking them. My colleague, my former co-lead, Meg Mitchell, and I, again, both of us are fired, spent one whole month working on a letter signed by many primarily computer vision researchers and many others, because Amazon VPs were trying to attack the technical merit of the work. And so we had about 70-something signatures, and we put it out, and we called them to stop selling it to their facial recognition system to police. And they have a 1-year moratorium or something like that now after the protests, the Black Lives Matter protests. But there's a lot of stuff that led up to that moment. Right now, the Google Walkout for Change, that started this movement that started about 2 years ago or so, when there were 20,000 women who walked out protesting the way in which they were treating harassers versus me, Meg, and others. Not 2 years later, they're still doing the same thing, right? Came to our defense now, and they had this whole petition of demands that was signed by thousands of people. And this was one of the things that helped for our latest paper that's critiquing, or not even critiquing, that's talking about the potential harms, that trade-offs that we should think about for large language models, right? So in spite of a large company basically trying to discredit some of my work there, i.e. Google, after they fired me and they had an email talking about how it didn't have, relevant citations or whatever, there was a whole bunch of people that came to our defense. And so this work has now garnered a lot of attention, right? And a lot of praise even. And a number of people have already incorporated it to their curriculum, and a lot of people have already cited it. And it's like it's not even published in proceedings yet. We haven't even presented it to the conference yet. So collective movements are really important. Joy Buolamwini is one of the best people I've seen at using so many different modes of communication to drive real change. So one of the things that she has is this documentary Coded Bias, which I highly recommend you watch if you haven't. It talks about issues of repercussions of face surveillance. So I think it's very educational. And so she uses many different modes of communication. For instance, she was at Afropunk. She has this AI and I a woman poetry, spoken word. And this is one of the most effective papers I think I've ever worked on, because of the way that she was able to stay with this one idea for a long time and work with policy makers to affect, change in laws, work with artists, and she's she calls herself a poet of code, of course, an artist herself, an artist and a scientist, to deliver the message to different communities, etc. This is one of the works that, well, I don't have to talk about this. Sorry, just see. So I think that this is one of the talks that I didn't get to watch, but there's a short paper associated with it. I heard that it was a keynote at ICML 2012 by Carrie Wagstaff. And she talks about how in order to have impact in machine learning, there are a number of things that are important. Like there are all of these different things that need to happen. Phrase a problem, collect data, select features, choose an algorithm, choose metrics, interpret results, publicize, persuade users to adopt, etc. However, in the conferences, the only thing that seems to matter is this middle part. And so she talks about how we're too focused on this middle part. And I think that is sort of in line with what I've been trying to say. And I think this is because of the hierarchy of knowledge, where certain kinds of knowledge and contributions are valued much more than others, when we need quite the opposite. This is another paper. Well, yeah, I don't think I'm going to talk too much about this, but this is a very interesting paper that talks about, that says basically that cryptographers should take the blame for not stopping mass surveillance. And part of it is because of how abstract the work has become and how people don't take context into account when they're working on it. So for instance, if you say Alice and Bob are trying to communicate, and there's an adversary, and you're just sort of creating these abstract Alice, abstract Bob, abstract adversary, you miss certain parts of what of the problem, right? Like, so who Alice is, what resources Alice and Bob have versus the adversary, etc., can change the kind of the solutions you're trying to come up with. I heard this wasn't well received by the cryptographic community, but I'm not exactly sure. But I really enjoyed this paper. It's like 40 pages or so. So again, like, because of this hierarchy of knowledge, I've heard people talking about me in certain ways. What does she really do in computer vision? What was the algorithmic component of her work? What exactly has she done? And I'm like, why is this the pinnacle of something that's supposed to be considered rigorous or work or impactful work? Why is this the thing that everybody is looking at? Well, why is this the thing we have to do? I mean, we've all seen, I don't know, in conferences, like people submit papers and people be like, oh, but it's not novel, or oh, but this is just a data set paper. Why are those things that are so important for us? And I'll say it's because of the hierarchy of knowledge. So here's a book called Ghost Work, written by Mary Gray. And so here it says, AI's dirty secret is how much human labor lurks inside apparently automated systems. So it talks about how, companies are creating an underclass around the world of data annotators and all these laborers. But because we're trying to say that this work is not so important, so hard, people don't need to get paid a lot for it. We've created this hierarchy of knowledge that now creates this second class citizens across the world that are just doing all of the data annotation for not much work, much money at all, so that the researchers who are considered to have who are like at the higher level of the hierarchy of knowledge are the ones getting all the credit and the money and everything else for it. But I think this is extremely dangerous, because one of the issues that we're having right now, where people are just gathering data from everywhere and not really spending a lot of time and effort into and care with which they're gathering and annotating data sets, is creating all sorts of problems. But because you can't even, so imagine I ask a PhD student or somebody to spend 3-4 years, gathering and annotating a data set or figuring that out. And then they can't, where are they going to publish their findings or the process by which they're using to create and annotated the data, etc. That's not considered important or rigorous work right now. Like there aren't venues where you can, publish these things. I know some people are creating such venues, which is great, like journals and venues at conferences where you can publish this type of work. But I think that's really important in order to actually make progress in some of the issues that we're seeing today. So here are some works that talk about issues with data sets used in computer vision. Vinay and Ababa have a great work. Emily and Alex and my former team do, and Morgan, who interned with us, do great work in this area. Emily has this work, this talk at NERV's Critical Perspectives in Computer Vision that talks a little bit about this. And that this is one of the papers that by Vinay and Ababa. So because of this hierarchy of knowledge, even works that are trying to kind of address some of the issues that I've talked about can miss the mark or sometimes make things worse. So actually, there's a paper called, I don't think I have this, Fairness and Abstraction, by many people, including Sorel and Suresh. That paper also talks about some of the issues of just talking about fairness in the abstract without taking context into account. So and another thing we people talk about is parachute science, but there's also, it has like many different names where people come, there's a particular community, let's say indigenous community, that has a lot of knowledge passed down through generations, etc. And some outsider comes, I think we've seen this in like pharmaceutical companies or something. They come here to study stuff about the indigenous community, whatever. They don't have an equal relationship. They don't have a collaborative relationship. They take whatever this group of people, the knowledge this group of people has, they go back. This group of people is getting a lot of praise. They're making money. They're getting tenured. They're getting whatever. This group of people, the knowledge they have is not even considered knowledge because, again, of the hierarchy of knowledge. This is happening even in works centered around fairness and ethics, etc. It's while I'm working on this field, people not in marginalized communities at power were telling me that my work is not up to par, my work that is trying to address the issues that my community faces. And so this issue results in many different issues in Silicon Valley, right? So then the efforts to undo some of the harms that we've created by creating ethics boards or initiatives around ethics or whatever now exclude people at the margins and have only certain kinds of people in it. So then that's obviously not gonna be conducive to technology that mitigates harm to people at the margins. So one of the things I was asked by when I gave a talk at Caltech, and Perona was telling me, I was going in and out of science and activism. He asked, what about curiosity-based research? So I have the same questions. Whose curiosity-based research is currently being funded? Whose voice is being amplified? One example here is automated gender recognition. I don't know if this was created because of somebody's curiosity or if it was meant to address some issue, but automated gender recognition systems are very harmful especially to members of the trans community. And some people here have written about why. And so clearly this was not, the curiosity of people in the trans community was not that was driving this research. So I wanted to I guess the point I wanted to make here is that the assumption that people's position in society is not affecting the research that they do, whether it's curiosity driven or otherwise, is false. And the view from nowhere, the critique of the view from nowhere, this is kind of what it addresses. And so this results in this hierarchy of knowledge where those who have power are kind of gatekeeping what kinds of knowledge are considered important or good, etc. And it's not just an industry versus academia issue. It permeates all of them. And so I think that it's really important to look at the foundations of how we teach science and technology related things, and move away from this notion of the view from nowhere. And I think it affects all parts of the research ecosystem, from which questions are asked to, what rigorous research means, what knowledge means, what impact means. And so I wanted to close by, these were some of the books I had on my shelf when I was like an undergrad or early grad student. I don't know, MATLAB, signal processing stuff, and transistor stuff, whatever. And none of these discussed any of the stuff I'm talking about right now, right? None of them. And so the books I've been reading these days these are some examples, sorting things out that talks about just the notion of, classification and how that affects society. Ruined by Design, Black Software, Algorithms of Oppression by Safiya Noble. So Ruha Benjamin, you can watch her talk at iClear too, or read and read this book. Haben is the first deafblind person to graduate from Harvard Law, and she works a lot on disability rights, the intersection of technology and disability rights. Simone Brown talks about history of surveillance and technology. Meredith Broussard has artificial and intelligence. And Black Software is by Charles McMillan. With that, I'd like to thank, my former members of my team, where, this team has been, it still is like a family. I think we still operate like a family. And I really hope that all of them get a break from this nightmare that's going on soon. And thanks.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gebru. So much to think about from that talk. We really appreciate it. We've gotten a lot of questions, a lot of great questions. So I'm going to try and get through as many as we can here in the next 10 minutes or so. And I apologize right off the bat for anybody whose question I don't get to. I want to start with one from Clara Del Junco, who her question summarizes a lot of other questions we've received in the chat. She asks, how can academics in machine learning or machine learning related fields act in solidarity with employees of tech companies, both researchers like yourself as well as contract and other workers at tech companies?
Oh, yeah. That's a very good question. I've been thinking about the same question. So is the question about academics in general, not just students? So I think that speaking up should not come with a cost. So a lot of schools have a lot of intertwined relationships with tech companies. Professors go in and out, they're students, they're all friends, conferences, it's your friend, it's your whatever, right? So you always have, when you speak up, it might come at a cost of, putting some relationship in peril or something. But in general, that means you are actually doing something, right? Like if it costs you zero, it usually means that like you might not be, really speaking up. But it's so hard to, I think, rely on individuals to do this stuff. So I really think there needs to be some sort of institutional or collective change, collective movements. What does that mean? I think that there needs to be many more alternatives for funding. And many more alternatives. I mean, we have to teach students that the pinnacle is not necessarily Google. I mean, it's not like Google or nothing, but it's really hard because since these tech companies are so powerful, I mean, they're on all facets of society right now. They're handling all aspects of society. I think it's really important to advocate for some sort of regulation that limits the amount of power they can have. And advocate for labor laws. That's really important. So unionize. And I also think that graduate students should unionize. And like when individual things like this happen, like stuff around me, a lot of visibility protects the person more. I mean, you can see that even with this much visibility, it didn't really protect me because they fired me. It didn't protect Meg because they fired her. But at the very least, like, I don't think they were able to make it such that I'm unhireable. That was what my mom was scared of. I mean, I'm glad she's not on Twitter because I hope she never goes there because she doesn't know. She doesn't know. So, but your parents, they get scared. They're like, they can make you unhireable. They can do this to you. They can do that to you. They can do that to you. And I think if people speak up and keep the story alive and make sure that they know you're watching, it's harder for them to do that kind of stuff. If you're quiet, then it's much easier for them to do that kind of stuff. And in general, you should make it much easier for people to speak up. One of the reasons people don't speak up, it's not, there's, let's say, a couple of people who do bad things, and there is a lot of people who keep quiet. And if I go and I tell somebody something, and like, let's say I'm talking about your friend or someone you've known for a long time or whatever, the first reaction is like, no, so-and-so doesn't do that. So that's gaslighting, right? And so when that's your first reaction, because speaking up is already so hard, people are more incentivized to be quiet about this stuff. So by the time something comes out, too many people have already suffered. And the end result is still not going to be like something that's, commiserate with the amount of suffering that's been inflicted.
Great. The next question is from Jean Selick, who asks, what advice do you have for navigating the gatekeeping of fields lower on the knowledge hierarchy in tech, especially for junior scholars?
It's really hard because, so as a junior scholar, I don't feel like I tried to navigate it. I tried to establish my credentials in the the straight-laced kind of field, and but I think that for me, gender shades was really a huge learning experience because Joy did this really, really well. She was a master's student when we worked on this paper, a master's student. And a lot of people were doubting her abilities, but this is like in computer vision. Are you really a computer scientist and all that? So she found a PhD student, me, who believed in what she was doing. And the two of us were the ones who wrote a paper. I was a PhD student when we started working. She was a master's student. So we had to find, someone, each other, and we collectively advocated for each other. But I think I didn't tell anybody actually that I was working on this project. It wasn't I didn't write about it in my PhD thesis, nothing. I mean, until I didn't even know if we would publish it. And so, so what I would do, my advice usually is find the people who are like-minded and would advocate for you. That's one. But what my strategy had been in these kinds of situations to do the thing that's just like straight, right in the middle of the road, whatever that like you need to do to do the, like if you take a class, you have to take that class to get to this point, whatever, right? Like, so I would do that in your scholarship, but I would dedicate time to also work on the things that you might not get, people might not really understand. And I just dedicate time for that, but not put too much pressure on yourself if this thing doesn't really work out, right? But the thing is, because you don't put that much pressure on yourself for that thing, it might actually be the thing you do really, really well. And then eventually that might be the thing that you're known for. But it's not easy, because institutions don't like change. And I even after all this, I was talking to some students, who told me that they have reading groups and they have all this stuff, but they don't really have support from like, members of the, faculty, et cetera, et cetera. So usually the students, I would say, are at the forefront of things more than, I'm sorry, but like more than the people who stayed at institutions longer.
I'm going to fit in one more question, if that's okay. This is from Chris Grazul, who asks, given your experience, do you believe data scientists have a role to play in the development of legislative regulatory frameworks around machine learning and AI and its applications? And if so, how do we ensure data scientists have the historical and sociological knowledge necessary to make responsible policy recommendations?
Yeah, this is a really important question because people always ask me, if I have like in interviews and stuff, if I have any recommendations for regulation, and I'm always really, really scared to say, to just come out and say, oh yeah, like do X, Y, and Z, because I feel like you have to be really, really careful and intentional when you make recommendations. But I think data scientists have a role to play. And when you say, how do you make sure that they have the historical knowledge? So first is to like read some of the works that I mentioned in my talk, but the second one is, like I said, the hierarchy of knowledge. So when you are thinking about legislative change or whatever, there need to be a lot of people at the table, and their voices and their ability to shape the future shouldn't be minimized because they're low on the totem pole. So what's happening right now is because a lot of the experts, supposed experts that are being, that have like, who do the governments meet with, right? They meet with the leaders of the tech companies, et cetera, et cetera. They're not meeting with the people who are most negatively impacted by the tech companies. They don't have equal sort of representation. So what's happening right now is a lot of the future of this legislation is being is being instituted and imagined with a lot more consultation of the people at the top, who are kind of like creating these tech companies and benefiting from them, rather than the people at the bottom.
All right, thank you so much, Dr. Gebru. I'll send it over to Nick now to say a final thank you and wrap us up.
Thank you so much, Timnit. It's been a real pleasure having you. We really appreciate your time. I think I get the privilege of the last question. I just wanted to say I found your talk incredibly profound. I really enjoyed how you worked in so many different concepts. I was reminded of, the race as a social construct, and I really enjoyed how you weave that into some of your tech work. And I was also reminded throughout many parts of your talk about Kuhn's structure of scientific revolutions and all of your discussion on gatekeeping. I really liked how you weaved in so many of these, everything from journalistic ethics to some of the social constructs. Beautiful. I wanted to sort of bring a couple of things together in my last question, which is, you mentioned this thing about parachute science, and I thought that was really interesting. Okay, because I said, I work on some things related to the digital divide, and I said, this is us. Okay, this is us. Okay. I also work on some things related to anti-censorship, and the whole concept of the view from nowhere and the neutrality. I mean, our community has grappled with that too. And so as a gatekeeper, as someone who's at the top of your hierarchy of knowledge, I feel a profound responsibility here to do something with what you've taught us today. And I wanted to kind of come back to this parachute science thing that you mentioned. So on the one hand, tech isn't neutral, right? We shouldn't be sitting back pretending that what we do in computer science has, no social impact, no social implications. I think that it's important to engage on problems that do have social impact. On the other hand, how do we sort of draw the line between, or how do we basically balance, working on problems that have that kind of social impact and require that kind of engagement without doing the parachuting that you mentioned? What is your advice on that? As the incentives are aligned to parachute, and some of us are thankfully at the high enough in the hierarchy that we don't have to abide by all of those incentives. So, but what is your advice?
I have some advice on that, which I'm trying to follow, but I also don't know if I'm not always doing the right thing. But so one thing to think about, in my opinion, is to think about. Well, so let me give you an example. Okay, so I'm working on this project on spatial apartheid in South Africa. So I'm analyzing the effects of spatial apartheid in South Africa using satellite imagery. And how did we get to this project? It was not my idea at all. It was, at some point, I started calling people who I know, who are kind of my friends, in African institutions, different parts of the continent. And I asked them, I was like, if you had no constraints, resource constraints, no constraints on students, etc., what kind of problems would you work on? because that assumes that given their context, they know there's a lot of things that need to be done, but maybe they don't have the resources. Maybe they don't have, I don't know, other kind of. So I asked that. So one of them, the next day, she's like, she told me about, like right away about this spatial part thing. The next day, I was like, oh my God, we should work on that. Then we were like, okay, which student should we have? And then there was this one student, Raseja, who she had worked with, and she thought, okay, this would be a good student. Because for both of us, it was very important for this to be led by a South African student, and hopefully someone who has, experienced the effects of spatial apartheid. So that was Raseja. So we first, she started working on this, and it was it's her master's thesis. She started working on this. She didn't have enough funding to work on it. And at some point, there was some company that was like, oh, if you change, the direction to be blah, 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 then we could give you money. But she didn't want to. She really wanted to work on this project. So we had to try to figure out how to, get her additional funding, etc. And so, so when this paper comes out, I hope we've literally been working on it since 2017, 18. So finally, Raseja now has her is about to get her master's thesis, but it was a hard work gathering data and all that. And so what does this do, in my opinion? When this paper comes out, first of all, the lead institution is going to be a South African institution. So the institution that's going to get most of the credit, most of the fanfare is going to be a South African institution. The student who's going to be the star of the show is a South African student who grew up in a township. We're talking about townships and stuff. I think my role in this whole project was to sort of try to make sure that it comes to fruition. I mean, I was learning most from, I brought some of my expertise because I had worked with Street View data and all that. So I could bring in some of my expertise, but I would say I'm a little bit more on the background. What would be super weird for me is if I worked on this project and all of us were in US institutions and there were no South Africans. I honestly don't even know how you'd be able to do that, right? So I feel good about it because of those things, right? So it's not just that we did this project and now I'm just going to go around and give talks, and which I might or whatever, and I'll get praised for it. We did this project and somebody else who was also a victim of some of the things we're discussing is the star of the show and also has benefited from just the work itself as well. So that's sort of what I would recommend, don't assume that, they don't know what the issues are, right? A lot of times that they do, they might not have. So first ask what people need, right? And then there's some really simple stuff. For instance, there's this AI for social good summit that happens in Geneva. I don't know if it still happens, but it was like some UN thing. And then, when we're there, a lot of people are talking about Somalia and blah, 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 and this and that. There's a German guy talking about Somalia. There's some other person talking about this and this. There's no Somalians talking about Somalia. We're not in Somalia. We're in Geneva. It's a very expensive city to fly to. Nobody from Somalia is going to get a visa to go there. Nobody, so there's some simple things like this. If you're going to have an AI for social good conference and your focus is going to be like an African, country, perhaps you should have it in an African country and go there. And then a lot of people will come and then you'll learn about, whatever issues people have, and you can learn about some interesting have some interesting collaborations and have, learn about some interesting issues that there might be for you to work on.
Thanks. I have about 3 follow-up questions, but I think we should respect your time and also the time of our audience. I have to say personally, that was hugely helpful for me, and I think I must let you know, I think your talk had a profound impact on me as an audience member, and I look forward to hopefully following up with you, so we can make positive change in the world, hopefully together. So,
thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. I'll remind folks that next week our series continues. It's going to be a tough act to follow, I think, but March 1st we'll have Deirdre Mulligan joining us. And so I look forward to seeing many folks next week. And one final thing, I know, yes, I always forget too. If you enjoyed the talk, you'll hopefully have a chance to see it again on our YouTube channel. Also, there's a bunch of other resources here that I think that I should remind people of. I think one of the things, I think in light of what we just heard about, I'll bring up the Data and Computing Summer Lab. So that's a great opportunity for undergraduates, high school students. It's a often diverse group of students as well, working on topics increasingly in areas I think that have important social impact. And so if Dr. Gebru's talk today inspired you to make a positive change in data science, I encourage you to look at the Summer Lab program as well. So again, we'll see folks next week. And Timnit, thank you so much. Fantastic talk. It was an honor to host you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.